Okay, this is the beginning of the third video. I've got to go back and make something clear. I'm going back up to bottleneck again. Again, this has to do with reduced population size leading to low genetic variation. Again, the issue here is, and I think this is obvious, you get a bottleneck in, for what we're talking about when a population crashes, and the crash is caused by destruction of habitat. So who survives? Uh, the cutting of a forest has nothing to do with the genetic makeup. It's simply you can view it as a random kill. But again, the population becomes small and creates a bottleneck because of habitat destruction. Okay, now back down to invasive species. Example one, fire ants. Again, there's some background information that you can read. One of the big impacts was that these fire ants that were introduced to the United States eliminate native ants, and native ants are very ecologically important. A lot of them help plant wildflower seeds, and they're important parts of the ecosystem, but they've been replaced by this invasive species. They make croplands unplowable. If any of you have been in the deep south, you may know about this sort of thing. There's been a lot of research done to try to control this, and one of the things I often ask on the exam is the method used that's being tried right now to control the fire ant, and it is a fly. This fly has been obtained, and there's the fly. It's a very, very tiny little fly meant to control this tiny little ant. You can see this researchers down here working with a colony of these fire ants. They're probably about 2 or 3 thousand ants. You can see they're very, very tiny. The wasp, or the fly, I'm sorry, is even smaller. What it does is it crawls onto the ant and lays an egg right behind the head. When the egg hatches, the larvae cuts the head off of the ant and kills the ant. This fly has been released in Texas, and there's some initial good signs that it might be working. Another important invasive species that's infamous, I would say, is the gypsy moth. Again, the biggest problem has been in the Appalachians in the eastern United States. These brown areas up here are total defoliation by this moth. And often you'll see, even in our area, they're worried that the gypsy moth will enter Indiana, and you'll see these triangular traps that contain a pheromone. Um, this is what will allow people to know that it's arrived or not, so they can take control measures. But again, it's difficult to control once it's there because you can't go in and spray entire forests with insecticides. Another famous invasive species is Africanized honeybees, and again, there's a hyperlink here. You can find videos of this on YouTube if you wish. Um, it's again very aggressive bee. It was accidentally released in South America back in the 20s. It's made its way to the United States. It's not clear how far it will move, but again, you might want to take a look at the video. These are highly aggressive bees that interbreed with our native bees, and the aggressive trait sticks, so to speak. Another, you're not probably not familiar with this one, but another example of a famous invasive species is the brown snake in Guam, which is it's a tree snake, and it's led to the extinction of 15 species of birds. It attacks birds and eggs and so forth. Back to the United States, Dutch elm disease. Again, elm trees were once a dominant part of our landscape. Here you can see in the Appalachian Mountains the size of this elm tree. Sure, we get elms now, but they only get to a certain size, and they still are attacked by this disease, which was introduced to New York City uh, in logs many decades ago. So it's virtually wiped out our native elm trees. Another interesting one is kudzu. Here's a picture of the sort of famous story behind this scene here with this car, where presumably this kudzu, in a period of just a few days, grew over a fence and enveloped this car here. Whole landscapes in the south are covered with kudzu, and I've witnessed this myself. I drove through an area of like 100 miles where telephone poles and wires and virtually everything you could see was covered in kudzu. Probably the newest one that you may be familiar with right here in Indiana is the emerald ash borer, which is one of our newest invaders. It came into the United States up in this red zone in southern Michigan, and is spreading into Indiana, and it is in our county now. Many of you have probably seen these purple traps, which are set out to detect the presence of the emerald ash borer. Once it's here, there's really not much you can do. It's going to be, without a doubt, just lead to a complete wipeout of ash trees in our area, which are a valuable tree. Here you can see what the larvae under the bark do. These galleries you can see under the bark are caused by the larvae of this beetle and lead to the death of the tree. All right, more extinction threats: commercial hunting and poaching. Again, this is a illegal trade, $10 to $20 billion a year. I'm not going to say too much about this. Here are some interesting figures. For example, a chimpanzee is worth $50,000 to someone who's willing to illegally buy one. Rhino horns, $13,000 a pound. There's a lot of demand in Southeast Asia for medicinal purposes, aphrodisiacs, and so forth. Bushmeat is wild animals killed for their meat, and unfortunately, even in parts of Africa, gorillas and chimpanzees are still hunted for their meat, and this is obviously a problem. Okay. Elephants, of course, were hunted for their ivory. They have been protected. And in places like Kenya, that's been relatively successful. As a matter of fact, elephants are coming back and are actually questioning whether they should start limited hunting, charging big fees to get money to help conservation efforts. So this is sort of a controversial thing that's going on. Again, other extinction threats. And again, if you notice, we're going from the most important extinction threats to ones that are important but perhaps are less farther down the list. So other extinction threats: predators and pest control. I mentioned today in lecture that Carolina parakeet was driven to extinction because it fed on fruit trees. Prairie dogs are almost gone, and nearly all black-footed ferrets. Ferrets are predators, natural predators of prairie dogs. So if you get rid of the prairie dogs, you lose ferrets. And of course, these dig holes in ranchers' lands, and so they're considered a pest, and they've been shot and reduced. Exotic pets. This is, I guess, a sort of a peeve of mine. There's the Carolina parakeet again. Collectors. You need to know, for example, parakeets. I think it probably should be illegal for anyone to own a parakeet. Of course, they do. Some that you buy in pet stores are bred and so forth, but a lot aren't. And there are demands for wild and rare parrots, and 50 die for every one that's sold. They'll simply cut a tree down just to get a parrot out of the tree. Lots of endangered parrots. If we get to fish, exotic fish in Southeast Asia, for example, they'll use dynamite, cyanide to in rivers and in the ocean just to stun or partially poison fish in collecting efforts. Orchids and cacti are most threatened because there's a lot of collectors that'll pay big money for these, especially orchids. There are a lot of just people that will pay tens of thousands of dollars for rare orchids. And again, whole forests and trees are cut down. A lot of these orchids grow in the tops of large trees in the rainforest, so you cut the trees down to get the orchids. And briefly mention climate change. Of course, this is a big issue in the news, and I don't want to spend much time on it. It's a controversial area. Again, the scientific perspective is that climate change is causing harm to habitats, big problem with reduction in biodiversity and so forth. But even without climate change, these other things are causing massive extinctions without even thinking about climate change. Solution, just quickly, bioinformatics. Okay, this is the notion of that basically you can't protect stuff unless you know what's there. So there's a big effort to use the internet to gain basic information on everything that we know, from DNA to the range of species to the names of species, so that when people are interested in preserving biodiversity, they have ready access to all available knowledge. So there's a big effort to use bioinformatics to really assemble all known knowledge on the internet. And here's a hyperlink relative to the groups I work with, which is sort of an effort to get information on leafhoppers on the internet. International treaties. We'll just leave it at that, that there are international treaties and so forth. These have largely failed. People sign on, but there's little enforcement and so forth. I want to focus more on our laws, and one in particular, the Endangered Species Act of 1973 is important to know. And this makes it illegal to trade or transport endangered or threatened species. This is what I mentioned in class today. If something is considered or legally classified as endangered, then a whole host of laws come into act to protect that. Okay, and here's just some again, this is the important thing to know, is that we do have laws to protect species and so forth, although they're constantly under challenge. Private landholders have a big role. Again, I'm not going to ask you the specific, like I'm not going to ask you about National Association of Homeowners, but just be aware that there are private efforts to protect land. Probably the most important thing is, what do we do about protecting biodiversity? And that is to focus on what are called hot spots. Most people think that it's really too late to piecemeal protect individual species and so forth, but we get the most bang for the buck trying to preserve areas on the planet that have incredible biodiversity and just try to at least save some of the last remaining parts of the planet that harbors this. Okay, I'm going to check my time. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'll have one last short video covering this last section.